Part 1. The Escape to Dawn. The bleak dawn that followed the fall of the safe zone in Montreal was a canvas of despair and uncertainty. Robert's family, along with a handful of other survivors, trudged through the decaying outskirts of the city, the memories of last night's carnage casting long shadows in their hearts. The city they once knew was now a sprawling necropolis, overrun by legions of the undead. Julia, Robert's wife, clutched their daughters close, her eyes a mirror of the fear and determination that had kept them alive through the night. The small group moved in silence, each lost in their thoughts, the only sounds being the distant moans of the undead and the crunch of rubble under their feet. As they navigated the labyrinth of desolation, they stumbled upon an abandoned school bus, its yellow paint faded and windows shattered. With a new sense of purpose, they decided to use it as their escape vehicle. Tom, a mechanic who had survived the onslaught, worked tirelessly to bring the engine back to life. Meanwhile, Julia and the others scavenged the surrounding buildings for supplies. The world outside was a horror show, streets littered with the remnants of a battle lost, the air heavy with the stench of death. They moved quickly, aware that every moment spent in the open was a risk. Back at the bus, Tom's efforts bore fruit as the engine sputtered to life, its roar a signal of hope in the desolate silence. The group gathered, their faces etched with exhaustion but illuminated by a flicker of hope. They piled into the bus, their hearts pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. As they began their journey, the sun rose higher, casting a pale light over the city. The road ahead was fraught with danger, the streets teeming with the undead. Julia took the wheel, her hands steady despite the chaos that unfolded around them. The bus weaved through the abandoned cars and barricades, a beacon of life amidst a sea of death. Their destination was unclear, but their goal was simple: survival. Rumors of a safe haven beyond the city boundaries spurred them on, a mythical place where humanity still held its ground against the tide of the undead. But as they ventured further, a new horror emerged. Among the shambling hordes of the undead, creatures of a more sinister nature began to appear. These were not just the mindless dead. They were something else, something more malevolent. Their eyes glowed with a ghastly light, and their movements were swift and purposeful. The bus journey turned into a terrifying chase as these new adversaries pursued them through the ravaged streets. Julia's driving became a desperate bid for escape, each turn and swerve a dance with death. The children cried in fear, while the adults prepared for a fight they knew they could not win. As they reached the city limits, the bus was surrounded. The living dead clawed at the doors, their groans a chorus of hunger. The new creatures, leaders of the undead pack, converged on the bus, their eyes burning with an unholy fire. In that moment, as despair threatened to engulf them, an unexpected ally appeared. A group of armed survivors, part of a militia fighting to reclaim the city, descended upon the scene. A fierce battle ensued, the sound of gunfire and screams filling the air. The militia's intervention turned the tide. The undead were pushed back, giving the bus and its passengers a chance to escape. As they sped away, leaving the chaos behind, Julia looked back at the city, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Robert's sacrifice had given them this chance to live. The road ahead was uncertain, the future a murky path shrouded in fear and doubt. But in their hearts, the flame of hope that Robert had ignited continued to burn, a beacon guiding them toward a new dawn in a world lost to the night of the living dead. Part 2. The Road. Less traveled. The bus, carrying Robert's family and the few survivors, rumbled down the desolate highway, leaving behind the shattered remains of Montreal. The sky was a dreary gray, mirroring the uncertainty that lay ahead. Julia drove steadily, her eyes focused, while the passengers sat in tense silence, each lost in their own haunted thoughts. As they journeyed, the landscape around them bore the scars of chaos. Abandoned vehicles littered the road, and the eerie stillness was occasionally broken by the distant groans of the undead. In this new world, the once familiar scenery took on a sinister aspect, as if nature itself had succumbed to the pervasive dread. Their immediate goal was to find a rumored refuge, a place where survivors had reportedly gathered. But as miles turned into hours, doubt crept into their hearts. Was this haven real, or just a desperate fantasy born from the collective fear of the survivors? The tension inside the bus was palpable when suddenly a figure emerged from the roadside woods, causing Julia to slam on the brakes. The figure was a man, haggard and injured, limping towards them with a hand outstretched. After a hurried discussion, they decided to take a risk and let him in. The man introduced himself as Marcus, a lone survivor from a nearby town. His tale was one of horror and loss, echoing their own experiences. Marcus spoke of a safe zone to the north, confirming their hopes. The news invigorated the group, providing a renewed sense of purpose. As they continued northward, the landscape grew wilder, the urban sprawl giving way to dense forests. The road became rougher, and the bus struggled on the uneven terrain. It was during one such struggle that disaster struck. A sudden, ear-piercing shriek echoed through the woods, startling the group. It was unlike any sound they had heard before, an unholy amalgamation of a scream and a growl. From the tree line, a new horror emerged. These were not the sluggish, decaying undead they had encountered before. These creatures were different, faster, more aggressive, their bodies mutated into grotesque forms, as if the virus had evolved. The bus was quickly surrounded. Julia tried to maneuver, but the bus was trapped. The group prepared to defend themselves, knowing this could be their last stand. The fight was brutal and desperate. Marcus, revealing a surprising proficiency in combat, fought alongside them with fierce determination. In the midst of the chaos, a stroke of luck, or perhaps fate, intervened. A convoy of armed vehicles burst onto the scene, their guns blazing. They were a group of survivors, part of a militia that had been patrolling the area. The militia's arrival turned the tide of the battle, driving the mutated undead back into the woods. After a tense standoff, introductions were made. The militia leader, a stern woman named Commander Blake, explained that they were part of a network of survivors working to reclaim and protect what was left of humanity. Commander Blake offered to escort the group to the safe zone. The relief was palpable, but so was the realization that their journey was far from over. As they set off again, now part of the convoy, the landscape around them seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper. Night fell as they approached the safe zone, a fortified compound hidden in the mountains. The sight of the high walls and armed guards was both intimidating and reassuring. Inside, they found a community struggling to maintain a semblance of normal life amidst the apocalypse. But even within these walls, safety was an illusion. That night, a new terror unfolded. The compound was rocked by a series of chilling screams. The mutated undead had found them, launching a ferocious assault on the safe zone. The battle raged throughout the night, a nightmarish struggle for survival against a seemingly endless tide of horror. Amidst the gunfire and the screams, a terrifying realization dawned on the survivors. The virus was evolving, and the dead were no longer the only monsters they had to fear. As dawn broke, the compound stood, but at a terrible cost. The night's events had shattered any illusion of safety, and the survivors knew that the fight was far from over. In this new world, every day was a battle, and the darkness was always just beyond the walls, waiting to claim them. And in the heart of that darkness, something even more sinister was stirring, a threat that could change the very nature of the nightmare they were living. The road ahead was uncertain, and the only thing they knew for sure was that the horror was far from over. Part 3. The Forsaken City. The dawn broke over Montreal, casting a pale, sickly light over the ravaged city. Emily, Robert's wife, watched from a crack in the boarded-up window of their makeshift refuge, a decrepit warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The world outside was a grotesque caricature of what it once was. The streets were littered with abandoned vehicles, the buildings bore the scars of the night's horrors, and the pervasive silence was intermittently broken by distant guttural moans. Robert, his face etched with exhaustion and determination, gathered the small group of survivors they had encountered during their escape. Among them were a nurse named Clara, an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and a young boy, Lucas, who had lost his parents. They had all converged in this unlikely sanctuary, united by the singular goal of survival. The group huddled around a dimly flickering candle as Robert laid out a map of the city, his finger tracing a route to what he hoped would be their salvation, a rumored military safe zone located at the port. The journey there would be perilous, through streets now teeming with the undead. As they prepared to set out, the silence of the morning was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. They rushed to the window to see a horrifying sight. A group of survivors, not unlike themselves, were being overrun by a horde of the undead. The creatures moved with a terrifying ferocity, their decaying bodies a grotesque display of their insatiable hunger for the living. The scene instilled a new level of fear in the group. Emily clutched Robert's hand, her eyes reflecting the terror that gripped her heart. Robert knew they could not delay any longer. With a heavy heart, he led his group out of the warehouse into the perilous streets of Montreal. Their journey was a harrowing ordeal. The city they once knew was unrecognizable, its once bustling streets now a labyrinth of death. They moved stealthily, avoiding the undead whenever possible. But sometimes confrontation was inevitable. Robert, armed with a makeshift weapon, protected the group with a fierce resolve, his every action driven by the primal urge to keep his family safe. As they navigated through the city, they witnessed scenes of utter despair. Survivors, driven mad by fear, turned on each other. Buildings burned unchecked, casting an eerie glow over the streets. And everywhere, the undead lurked, their moans a constant reminder of the omnipresent danger. The group eventually reached a large supermarket, its doors barricaded. Inside, they found a small community of survivors who had fortified the building. The leader, a stern woman named Marjorie, allowed them entry after a tense standoff. Inside, they found a semblance of order amidst the chaos. The survivors had pooled their resources and skills, creating a fragile but functioning community. Robert and his group were given shelter and food, a luxury in these dire times. They met other survivors, each with their own harrowing tale. Among them was a former police officer, Daniel, who spoke of a government convoy that was heading to the port to evacuate survivors. The news reignited hope in Robert's heart. The port was their destination, and the possibility of a convoy meant there might be a chance for them to escape the city. But Marjorie warned them that the journey to the port was fraught with danger. The streets were swarming with the undead, and other, more sinister threats lurked in the shadows. That night, as they rested in the relative safety of the supermarket, Emily confided in Robert her fears for their daughters, who were with relatives in a neighboring town. The thought of their children out there, possibly facing the same horrors, weighed heavily on them. Determined to find a way to reunite with their daughters, Robert and Emily decided to leave with the first light of dawn, heading towards the port. The supermarket community, understanding their plight, provided them with supplies and a radio to stay informed. As they set out, the city seemed to watch them with hollow, lifeless eyes. The journey ahead would be their greatest challenge yet. The streets of Montreal, once a symbol of life and vibrancy, had become a macabre maze, a test of their will to survive in a world where the dead walked and the living feared the coming of each new dawn. Part 4. The Siege of Shadows. The dawn that followed their harrowing escape from the city was a pale, ghostly light that offered no warmth or comfort. Robert, his wife, and their daughters found themselves in a world that had drastically changed overnight. They were among a small group of survivors, all huddled together in an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Montreal. The house, once a symbol of pastoral serenity, was now a makeshift fortress. The windows were boarded up, and every creak and groan of the old structure was a reminder of the horrors lurking outside. The group had managed to scavenge some supplies, but the reality was stark. They were low on food, water, and ammunition. As the day wore on, the sounds of the undead grew louder and more frequent. The moans and shuffles of the walking dead were a relentless reminder of the siege they were under. The group took turns keeping watch, their eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But it wasn't just the undead they were afraid of. The collapse of society had brought out the worst in some of the living. Bands of marauders roamed the countryside, preying on the weak and vulnerable. Robert, once a mild-mannered project manager, found himself evolving into something he barely recognized: a leader, a fighter, a survivor. He worked alongside the others, fortifying their defenses and strategizing their next move. The farmhouse was a temporary haven, but they all knew it wouldn't hold forever. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the area and reducing visibility to near zero. It was then that they heard it, a guttural, growling noise that seemed to come from all directions. The undead were closing in, drawn by the scent of the living. The siege began with a suddenness that took them all by surprise. The undead emerged from the fog like phantoms, their grotesque forms barely visible in the dim light. The survivors fought back with everything they had, but for every undead creature they took down, more seemed to take its place. In the midst of the chaos, a piercing scream cut through the night. Robert's youngest daughter had ventured too close to a window, and a pair of decayed hands had burst through the boards, grasping for her. Time seemed to slow as Robert lunged forward, pulling her away from the clutches of the undead. The window was now a gaping hole, and the undead began pouring in. The fight became a desperate struggle for survival. The living room of the farmhouse turned into a battleground, with the survivors fighting back-to-back against the encroaching horde. Robert, wielding an old hunting rifle, took down undead after undead, but he could see the fear in his family's eyes. They were outnumbered, and their defenses were crumbling. In a moment of clarity amid the chaos, Robert knew they couldn't stay any longer. He yelled for the group to fall back, leading them to the back door. They burst out into the foggy night, the undead trailing behind them like a macabre procession. They ran through the fields, the fog disorienting them, the sounds of their pursuers a constant threat at their heels. The night was filled with horrors, but Robert kept his family close, his resolve unwavering. They had to survive. They had to find a new sanctuary in this world of shadows and death. As they disappeared into the fog, the farmhouse was overrun, a testament to the new reality. In the world of the living dead, nowhere was safe, and survival was a fleeting, fragile thing. Part 5. The Fractured Dawn. In the waning hours of night, the survivors of Montreal, cloistered within the remnants of the safe zone, faced a new dawn. The air, thick with the stench of decay, was a grim herald of the days to come. Robert, separated from his family during the frenetic escape, trudged through the desolate city streets, a shadow among shadows. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of life and culture, now lay in ruins, its skyline a jagged silhouette against the pale morning light. Buildings, stripped of their former glory, stood as hollowed husks, while the streets, now silent save for the occasional distant moan, were littered with the remnants of a world gone mad. Robert's journey was solitary, marked by a relentless determination. He moved stealthily, avoiding the undead that roamed aimlessly, their grotesque forms a constant reminder of the epidemic's toll. Every corner held potential peril, every shadow a lurking horror. As he navigated the once familiar streets, memories of his family flooded his mind, their laughter, their warmth, a stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving world he now traversed. The thought of finding them again, of reuniting in this nightmarish landscape, was the only flame keeping the dark at bay. The sun rose, casting long, haunting shadows across the city. The daylight brought little solace. It merely highlighted the devastation that enveloped Montreal. The undead, less active in the light, still posed a grave threat, their presence a chilling reminder of the city's fall. Robert encountered other survivors, each group eyeing the other with a mix of fear and desperation. Trust was a luxury long forsaken. Brief exchanges of information revealed the grim reality. No part of the city was safe, no haven lasted long, and rumors of a haven beyond the city's limits were just that, rumors. As the day wore on, Robert stumbled upon a radio broadcast, a crackling voice speaking of a military outpost on the outskirts of the city, a potential sanctuary for those who could reach it. Hope, as fragile as it was, sparked within him. The possibility of reuniting with his family, of finding refuge, reignited his waning strength. Night fell once again, a curtain of darkness enveloping the city. The undead grew more active, their ghastly moans a macabre lullaby in the desolate night. Robert found shelter in an abandoned store, the remnants of its past life scattered around him. As he settled in, the weight of his solitude pressed heavily upon him. In the heart of night, a sudden commotion stirred him from his restless slumber. Hushed voices, hurried footsteps, signs of life. Peering through a gap in the barricade, Robert saw a group of survivors, among them familiar faces, his family. The reunion was a moment of rare joy in a world consumed by horror. Embraces were shared, tears shed, and stories exchanged. They spoke of their escape, of the friends lost, and the dangers faced. Together again, they were a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. But their respite was short-lived. The undead, attracted by the noise, began to converge on their location. The family, along with a few other survivors, prepared for a desperate stand. Barricades were reinforced, makeshift weapons readied. They would fight, not just for survival, but for each other. The night erupted into chaos as the undead assaulted their refuge. The battle was fierce, each survivor fighting with a ferocity born of desperation. Amidst the carnage, Robert stood as a guardian, his resolve unwavering. As dawn approached, weary and battered, the survivors emerged victorious. The undead lay scattered around them, a testament to their tenacity. The victory, however, was bittersweet. The city was lost, and their future uncertain. Together, Robert and his family, along with the other survivors, set out towards the rumored military outpost. Their journey was fraught with peril, but united, they held on to hope, a flickering flame in the ever-present shadow of the undead. Montreal, a city once teeming with life, now stood as a silent witness to the apocalypse. But even in its downfall, it held a promise that one day life would return, that the night of the living dead would give way to a new dawn,